Okay. Uh, Barrie Peterson.
Thank, thank you, Carl, and welcome everybody, including some of my friends in Edinburgh, Scotland. People in my poetry group and from St. Mark's Unitarian Church in Edinburgh. And some of my neighbors up in Pauling, New York are on there too, so welcome. Okay, we have black and white balloons from last night's 40th birthday party that somebody had, and they're kind of nice, and they kind of suggest a Manichaean view of the world, black and white, good and bad, which this talk will hopefully not go too far down that line. Election sermons are a tradition in America. I won't be endorsing a candidate or party, but struggle to deal with the pervasive dread of violence many of us feel. I was saying to somebody earlier that in my 50 years of attempting to preach and talk, this is the most difficult topic I have ever addressed. We need to allow ourselves to go deeper than speculating who's going to win, or actively campaigning or donating, which I know a number of you are, or trying to avoid the media barrage of propaganda and analysis. Let's begin by trying to define violence. The dictionary says it's behavior or treatment in which physical force is exerted for the purpose of causing damage or injury. This is a very narrow description, I think, omitting verbal abuse and psychological damage. I'll go personal here. My experience with the various forms of violence has been limited. Only once did my dad spank me. And he gave me the choice, the hand or his fraternity paddle. I chose the hand. Being very tall, I was never challenged to a fight nor initiated one on a school as a schoolboy. My brother and I were bullied on the school bus, forced out of a seat and belittled with this sneering name, Siggy. My father, Sigurd, was the son of Swedish immigrants in our farming community. In high school, basketball coaches urging physical aggression repulsed me, and I did not play football. During the Vietnam War, I didn't have to confront the draft, but considered filing as a conscientious objector. At peace protests in Washington, I avoided the group aiming for confrontation. I invite you all to contemplate for a moment your experiences with violence. Now I wish to examine the different types of violence. First, there's interpersonal violence. Bullying has risen to alarming levels in schools, rich and poor, white and black, and Spanish. Boys who are gentle or smart or non-athletic, and girls not fitting into arbitrary standards of dress or appearance seem targeted. Gangs are the next step, offering safety but expecting obedience, exacting obedience, and joining in ritual violence. I include in gangs both the street criminal gangs as well as the Greek letter groups. Every year, some young freshman at a fraternity dies of alcohol poisoning put on by his brothers. Then there's suicide as of interpersonal sort. The US suffers high rates among all ages and ethnic groups. The enablers of this self-destruction are social media, where no one is accountable and anonymity reigns. Gun addiction adds into suicide. More guns than people here in the United States. Instant lethal actions are possible for people feeling extreme emotions. Yearly, nearly 50,000 Americans die by murder or suicide. The second kind of violence, type of violence, I call social violence. There is domestic violence. Our Center for Safety and Change founder, Phyllis Frank, lamented to me the other day that in a 3-month period here in Rockland County last year, 4 women and 2 children were killed by men in 4 tragedies. Some observe that as we belatedly confront patriarchy, more men are threatened and lash out, encouraged by public figures, one of whom is running for president. Mass shootings is another form of social violence. Young white men inevitably are using weapons of war. The UU congregation of Knoxville, Tennessee, suffered 2 dead and 6 injured in 2008 by a hater of liberals. Do we have some plans for such an emergency here? Airline passengers disruptions already total 1,700 this year. Selfishness, not just alcohol, seems to be the blame. Freedom is not doing whatever you feel like, regardless of the impact on others. How Americans have distorted our Emersonian philosophy. Sports. The recent Yankees World Series game saw 2 fans try to rip the ball out of the gloves of a Dodger right fielder. They justified their action later as defense. At the same game, actor Wendell Pierce was harassed and objects thrown at him because he was being friendly with a Dodger fan. He left. Need we say more about violence in football? Hundreds of brain injuries yearly at all levels. Third area of violence that I'd like us to consider is the official state-sponsored violence. Stokely Carmichael, the Black radical Panther, was famous as saying, "Violence is as American as apple pie." Let's start with the genocide against Native Americans. I almost wore my t-shirt that had a picture of Geronimo with his guys, and it says, "Fighting terrorism since 1492. Then there are the witch trials in 17th century New England. Then we took over northern Mexico by force in the 19th century. And of course, we have enslaved African Americans from 1621 until 1865, and reoppressed African Americans after 1870 as Southern whites retook control. The South really won the Civil War. And Bob Dylan's song specifically deals with how that works politically. Another form of state-sponsored violence is, of course, war in all its forms. There have been efforts to limit the targets and set up courts to prevent war crimes. State violence would include executions, no longer public. Gee, are we ashamed of it? If executions are supposedly have a preventative effect, shouldn't we be doing them publicly? Police killings, state-sponsored violence, led to the Black Lives Matter movement. Some officers finally are beginning to be held responsible. Finally, prisons. In a way, this is a state-sponsored form of violence. The U.S. incarcerates 1.7 million people, far higher percentage per population than any other country. And many are men of color and from poor neighborhoods. Then there's ethnic cleansing and genocide as official sanctioned violence. Kosovo, Rwanda, and yes, what Israel is doing in Gaza. The fourth area of violence is religious violence. The Old Testament is a source of a lot of this. The excuses for God's chosen people to take over the land, used to this day. There are holy wars, Protestants versus Catholics. And looking around Ireland recently, where B and I have bought a house, I'm amazed that there is a stone standing on a stone in a former Catholic monastery or church. After Henry VIII and Cromwell blasting Catholic institutions, people, buildings. But then we have Hindu, Muslim religious violence in South Asia. And of course, we have the clergy sexual abuse and the covering up of that. I personally worked with Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, formerly of Newark, when I was at Seton Hall setting up the institutional work. He was a great supporter of what we were doing. Later, it turns out that he was a habitual sexual predator of seminarians. Then there's the enslavement of unwed mothers in Irish laundries and the taking of their babies. Revelations of that in Ireland have discredited the Catholic Church, so they no longer are able to prevent abortion rights, divorce, and gay marriage. Fifth, there's structural violence. This is a little bit more subjective, and some people may disagree. One doesn't have to be a Marxist to see the class divisions widening in our country. There are nearly 800 billionaires and 22 million millionaires in our country, while poverty persists for 17% of our children. Read Paul Kruger and Robert Reich for expert economic analysis of the divisive effects of money rushing to the top, and how people like Musk and Bezos manipulate the government to allow them to become monopolists. Finally, there is nationalist violence. Rebellions have relied on violence. Let's start with us in 1776. Haiti, soon after, 1790. France, 1785, around there. Russia, 1918. Ireland, 1920. The only exceptions are India, following Gandhi's nonviolent resistance to the British colonialism in 1948, and the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, and I would add South African independence movement led by Nelson Mandela. So there are some exceptions to a nationalist effort promoting independence. They don't always have to use violence. Now let's look at genocide as nationalist violence. Armenia, 1918. The Nazis, 1935 to 45. The Soviets during decades. Rwanda and Israel. Finally, and this is where I want to bring us today, political violence. And this is what we're all concerned about. Dark money enabled by Citizens United ruling, to me, that's violent. You're pouring money secretly into politicians' pockets, expecting them to do a deal. That the Supreme Court could not understand that because there wasn't a written contract between the money giver and the politician, I'll give you this in exchange for you doing that, because there wasn't a tit for tat, therefore it wasn't bribery, Really? Where has our Supreme Court been living for the last 100 years? That's not how business is done. Conspiracy theories undermine belief in uh, fact and our institutions. And of course, the major one there is the big lie. The big lie started with a certain person claiming that Barack Obama was a Muslim and not an American. It started there, and we see where it's gotten here in terms of denying the results of an election and attacking the results of Tuesday, unless he wins, of course, then it's a fair election. And using immigrants as diversions. And here's where I think Bob Dylan's song is, he sings about a principle, a technique, and whether it's the Southern white elite dividing the poor Black from the poor white, or a politician today dividing most Americans from immigrants, it's the same technique. Our failure to teach civics, history, and ethics has to be part of this. And I think we all have to own up to that. The fact that half the population believes this stuff is partly our fault because we have not done our job as educators. There is a, let's see here, I wanted to quote you. Let's see if I get the right piece of paper here. While still vice president and with FDR's support, wrote about the danger of fascism. He saw that what Hitler did in Nazi Germany and feared the same could happen in America. He worried that an unprincipled sociopath with a gift for marketing and self-promotion, sounds familiar, could turn some Americans into violent bullies if they felt abandoned and angry enough. I'm going to read that again. 1944, our vice president wrote, Hitler did in Nazi Germany and he feared the same could happen in America. Henry Wallace worried that an unprincipled sociopath with a gift for marketing and self-promotion could turn some Americans into violent bullies if they felt abandoned and angry enough. Prophetic, pathetic. Now, there is some hope here. In the UK, there have been some nasty anti-immigrant riots. And the police have tried to defend the that's being converted into a Ukrainian refugee center or whatever against the rioters. They are prosecuting the people throwing the firebombs and hitting bobbies over the head with their clubs. And they're also prosecuting the internet provocateurs as terrorists. Thank you. Finally, some holding accountable people who are promoting violence. The Philadelphia DA is suing Musk for bribing voters and talking as a person with high-level security clearance, talking with Putin continuously. Another sign of the times. National Guard are on alert to protect the polls and election workers in Oregon, Nevada, DC, and Colorado. An 18-year-old in Florida attacked with a machete two older women who were Harris supporters going to the polls. He's being prosecuted. 3 ballot boxes were burned in Oregon and Washington already. And perhaps the most important of all, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, the Georgia election workers that Giuliani defamed, were awarded $148 million of Rudy's assets. And the judge has ordered that they be turned over to these women. That's encouraging. So, what kind of response can we have to these different kinds of violence, especially at the political realm? I would refer you, as Carl did, to the chart on the back of our program, where we kind of graphically try to show that love is the central part of the UU message, with these other attributes feeding into it and interacting with it. So that's how we try to share our values. There are various philosophical positions regarding violence. There are the Quakers, who are basically pacifists and who mostly do not serve in a war or ask for alternative service. There are people who follow the just war theory. You know, war is only justified if certain things occur. Then there are jihadists of various types who claim God is on their side, whether they're a Muslim or a Christian nationalist. They are jihadists, saying these are the enemy. We've got to use our religion to back up our attack on them. The Buddhists have a whole philosophy about nonviolence and acceptance. The Hindus also, although the Hindus, their big epic talks about Arjuna being the great warrior. So we have to sort that out. So we need to figure out, where do we stand on this? What is our personal feeling about that? There are some dates coming up that we should be aware of and remember. December 11th is when the states certify the results. December 17th is when the Electoral College meets. January 6th, Congress ratifies. January 20th, Inauguration Day, and the observance of Martin Luther King's birthday. And then beyond that, there are ongoing dates. Hopefully, there will be the conclusion of the several legal processes involving Mr. Trump, and there will be some decisions made, some sentences given. Unless he somehow gains power and pardons himself and prosecutes those who tried to stand for justice. What can we do? I suggest we can contact officials asking what plans are in effect to protect democracy and from pressures, and to help election officials resist the intimidation. And we've heard all kinds of stories of election officials who did the right thing, getting death threats, etc. So let's contact our officials. Let's ask Ed Day, our county executive, what is being done to protect our voting process. The Board of Election Commissioners, Patricia Gibbons and Kathy Pretzingo, one Republican, one Democrat. What are they doing to make sure that, I mean, what would happen if a bunch of people with AK-47 showed up at an election polling booth or where the votes are being tallied? It happened already. It's likely to happen again. Let's contact our sheriff, Louis Falco, and ask him what plans they have to guarantee the process of democracy. Or our wonderful Attorney General, Letitia James. Secondly, we can support clean election groups. There's a group called Lawyers Defending American Democracy. And Mike, thank you, Mike, for telling me, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. These are legal experts who are trying to counter nasty doings to deny democracy. Any other comments you would add on that, Mike, in terms of groups to contact? Okay, thank you. We can advocate, number 3. Do we know that there are not white supremacists on our police forces? Do our towns and sheriff have procedures to prevent them from being hired? or if they are there, which they are all around the country, to either remove them because they cannot do their sworn duty if they are a white supremacist, should they not be eliminated from our police forces. Fourth, we can support the conclusion of whatever legal cases are still pending against Mr. Trump. We can advocate that President Biden and Attorney General Garland immediately prosecute terrorists who are popping up, threatening, agitating. We don't need to wait for January 6th, part 2. I think it's pretty clear what's being planned and what's being talked about. And I would remind us that the Supreme Court ruled that the president is immune from prosecution for actions taken as the president. Joe, what are you waiting for? And finally, we can support the restoration of the party formerly known as Republican. My Republican father would roll over in his grave if he saw what had happened to his distinguished party. But to look back at the whole thing, the big, long perspective, the biggest tragedy for the last 10 years is that the energies and minds of most Americans is consumed by the selfish and crazed gyrations of a con man, diverting us from together addressing the real and growing challenges of why so many are so desperate so as to fall for this. Climate change, that's the biggest violence of them all. We're killing the planet. Third issue we have not paid attention to because of our mania for following this craziness. The plutocracy, the gathering of wealth at the top, the corruption of government. Racism, rampant, not taken care of. Spiritual, emotional emptiness on the part of especially a lot of our young people. Immigration, not just ours, but around the world. Healthcare. These are the real issues that we've been diverted from addressing because of watching this crazy guy. So after the election, the newsletter this week tells about some things where you could participate in some discussions among other UUs. It's called Side with Love, Forward Together. The Unitarian Association is sponsoring Wednesday night from 8 to 9, a Zoom meeting for people to talk about how they feel or what their questions they have. And then the day after the election is called, gee, will that be this year, next year? They'll have another Zoom meeting. And then on November 19th from 8 to 9, they will have another opportunity for you to talk. Go to the First Unitarian Society website and click on to register for those.